Hey everyone, Rowan Dredge here. Welcome to Leadership Conversations. I've got Mark Griffiths with me from the UK. He's an Anglican minister, the vicar of St Michael's Warfield, and it's just fantastic to have you with us today, Mark. You've been sharing in leadership conferences and church over the weekend. Just great to have this conversation with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
To get started, just tell us a little bit about your history, your timeline, the things you've been involved in. You've been doing leadership and ministry and people work for a long time.
Sure.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, you'll detect quickly from the accent that by the grace of God I am Welsh. I grew up in a little valley town in a place called Maesteg, which is just outside Swansea. I went to school there. I left in 1986. Spent a year programming computers. Spent the 3 years after that in the Assemblies of God Bible College, which is in England. Went from there to be a children's pastor for the next 7 years in a place called Milton Keynes. From there, I joined the Assemblies of God national team, and I worked overseeing children's ministry in the Assemblies of God's 800 churches for the next 5 years. At the end of that period, I felt it was time to go on and lead church. And I was praying about which Assemblies of God church to lead. The English Assemblies of God General Superintendent was sending me his suggestions. And just looking at the suggestions and praying them through, I felt God say no to each opportunity. And then I got a little frustrated with God, as you do sometimes, and said, God, I have to go and lead something. So if this isn't it, what is it? And I felt God very clearly say that he wanted me to lead in the Church of England, in the Anglican Church of England. It came as a little bit of a shock to the system, primarily on account of the fact that I'd never been to a Church of England church. So I prayed a little.
Perish the thought that a Pentecostal would
indeed
actually go to a Church of England. You know, that's
it caused certainly a high level of consternation amongst my present church. They weren't quite sure that God would say something so wild and ludicrous, but I felt it was God. And at that time, I only knew one Anglican, and a chap by the name of Eric Delve, who at that point was the vicar of Maidstone.
a good man.
Indeed, a really good man. So I didn't need to pray very hard about which Anglican to talk to. I only knew one. So I phoned Eric up and I said to him, Eric, I may be losing it, but I think God has called me to the Church of England. Is this even possible? And Eric assured me that it was indeed possible and there was no doubt that I was losing it. So I went down and I spent the day with Eric in Maidstone. Had a look around his church. He was doing a phenomenal work in an Anglican setting, and that blew me away, really. And then Eric made the introduction to the bishop, and the bishop wrote to me and invited me to come and see him. Of course, I didn't know how Anglican structures worked, and I didn't realise that wasn't the done thing. There were a whole range of things you had to go through before you talk to a bishop. I didn't know, and God just made it possible. So my very first service in a Church of England church was as the assistant minister of St Mary's, Bletchley. So my first appearance in an Anglican church was as an assistant minister. And I didn't think that was at all possible.
Wow.
But God does what he likes. That's
It's
quite
amazing.
exciting. Indeed.
Amazing. So you're a Welsh Pentecostal trained, lots of years in the Pentecostal church, who's now been an assistant and now a senior minister in the Anglican Church in England.
That's right.
Yeah, wow. That's so, my own journey's actually a little bit similar in the other direction. I grew up as an Anglican, studied at the Baptist College.
Yes.
I've been an ordained Assemblies of God pastor, and now I'm the senior minister of a Church of Christ. So I often say to people, you just tell me what you want to hear, and I'll tell you from whichever perspective you need it from.
It's wonderful. So. Rowan Dredge is an ecumenical experiment.
Yeah, or somewhat confused as well.
Well, that's possible as well.
So that's a lot of history in a bunch of very different environments. Now the UK environment in and of itself in ministry is different. There's a lot of very unique, very significant things happening there around the world. I noticed your strong background in kids ministry. So talk me through just a little bit of your passions. Like, I mean, well, the conversation we use around here is, what would you do for nothing? Like, what just gets that part of your leadership and ministry life going with great passion?
Yeah. When I had to negotiate the Anglican structures, and they sent me away to a selection conference, they call it, and I sat in 3 interviews. As part of one of those interviews, somebody asked me a very similar question. They said, if they stripped everything else away from me, if they took away my family, if they took away my ministry, if they took away everything from me, what would be left of me? And I thought about it for a moment, and then I just felt prompted in my spirit, and I said to the individual, if everything else was taken away, the love of God would still compel me. And that's been my motivating force. And most of my ministry has been to do with how I maintain that pure motivation, that I'm motivated by nothing other than the love of God compelling me, not a desire to stand in front of lots of people, but a desire to communicate Jesus. And my desire to communicate Jesus to young people is based on the fact that there's a whole life to live if we can do that. It's really quite interesting. When a chap called Peter Brierley did some research in the UK on what makes churches grow, and more fundamentally, what makes people want to join a church. And he highlighted 4 things. And he said that the very first thing that attracts people to a church is the quality of the welcome, which is, well, it's actually a little depressing when I work so hard at my preaching, but so it's the quality of the welcome, what they get when they walk through the doors. The second thing was, how relevant is the preaching, not how good is the preaching or how biblically based is the preaching, how relevant is the preaching. And the third point is the quality of the youth and children's ministry. So if people come to a church and the quality of the youth and children's ministry is such that it just babysits young people and children, then people will make a conscious decision not to join that church.
Yeah, we've noticed here in our country as well that parents will position themselves in a much more sacrificial role for the sake of their children's spiritual well-being.
Yes.
And so, not that, a church would actually want to force a parent to do that, but they would for the sake of that. Yeah, wonderful. So that was the third point.
Yes, and the fourth point was, interestingly, the quality of the worship. And I was intrigued by that, because it wasn't about the style of worship. It was about the quality of worship, which is why some traditional churches can attract quite large attendance if the quality of the worship is great. So it's not about style, it's about quality of worship.
Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah, wonderful. So, 23 plus years of leadership, and I've obviously been sitting under your teaching just recently, and I'm convinced you've learned a thing or two along the way.
Yes.
What would be the handful of Mark Griffiths messages, like Mark Griffiths lessons that you would just go back to time and time again and be saying, what, these are the benchmark leadership lessons, the benchmark ministry experiences that have shaped me and formed me, and I'd love to be able to share them with people. What would some of those be?
Yes, I think the main thing that I learned on the journey was I am completely, utterly and totally dependent on God.
Yeah.
So every now and then I think I can do it. I have some gifts, I have some talents, I have some abilities, and sometimes I run at it with those particular things, and I usually end up bashing into brick walls. And I have to come back again and recognize that I am completely dependent on God. So the big lesson that I have learned and continue to learn is He is God and I am not. So every now and then I think that I am the omniscient one and I know all things. And I don't. I have to go back and say, God, how do I deal with this situation? Like all senior ministers, I have a tendency to believe that I'm omnipresent.
Yeah.
And I have a congregation that also believe that I'm omnipresent. They expect me to be in all places at all times. And I will die if I try and maintain that. And I run about. And a tendency to think that I am omnipotent, that I can do all things. I am the all-powerful one. And every now and then I like to stand in front of my congregations and say to them, I am fragile, wounded and broken, and I'm a sinner saved by grace. And every now and then, I like to highlight the things that I have done wrong. So in arriving at this brand new job last October, the first thing I had to do was cut the lawn. And the vicarage, which I now live in, is in an acre of ground, and they gave me a lovely sit-on lawnmower to do that with. But I'd confused the words lawnmower with the words quad bike, and when I tried to race it around the garden and jump over a ditch with it, I successfully managed to break £3,000 worth of lawnmower in my first week of my new job.
There you go.
So I needed them to know how fallible their new minister was, and to recognize that their life with God is lived personally with God and not vicariously through me.
So important, isn't it? It's such a tension for leaders, especially the leaders that they've got vision, they've got enthusiasm, they've got energy. They want to see people involved and engaged, and it breaks their heart when they're not.
Yes.
But really, when it boils down to it, in Christian ministry and Christian leadership, we're under shepherds.
Absolutely.
To the great shepherd. So
It's
an amazing lesson to learn.
It's that wonderful tension. A sociologist called Chana Ullman said that the typical person is not converted by God, but converted by an individual. So they give their lives to the person who at the front is communicating Jesus. And it becomes the job of the communicator to then point that person to God.
Yeah, brilliant.
And the difficulty with some of our churches is the minister forgets to do that. And so all the attention is laid upon the minister. And his job is to move out of the way and allow people to personally encounter Jesus. And sometimes our ego is built up by the fact that everyone is dependent on us. So it's really quite tricky to move out of the way and say, no, your relationship is lived out with a personal encounter with Jesus, not a personal encounter with me. I will let you down consistently, and God will never let you down.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. What else? What other sort of trademark or hallmark lessons along the way have you learned?
Well, they all compound together around that initial theme. With my new congregation, I'm very keen that they understand that we're developing a culture, not a list of statements by which they live their lives. So I'm trying to build a culture in which all people are valued, all contributions are valued. I'm a firm believer in the priesthood of all believers. So it's not about the chap at the front. So we're all valued, and the job of leadership within that culture becomes a job of empowerment and equipping and ultimately releasing. It's really difficult to let go sometimes. And we, even over the last 4 months, have sent a dozen people off to go and be leaders in different places, and to bless them and to send them when you know that you're giving of your best is really rather difficult. But we've created a culture that makes that happen. So we want that to drive out from us. I lead the Church of St. Michael the Archangel, Warfield. When I arrived in the church, I was told by lots of people that what you do for the first year is you look at the ground, you see what's growing, you evaluate, you make very little changes. Yeah. And I genuinely arrived with that in mind. The difficulty was that the church itself wanted to grow, it wanted to move, it wanted to change. At its heart, it was passionate and militant. It's a wonderful story. The church itself started just over 1,000 years ago.
That's amazing.
It's in the middle of the Windsor Great Forest.
You just got to stop there for a minute. You're talking to an Australian, and for us, 200 years is old. So we get to sit in front of all these. So you're telling me that the building that you have church in is
1,000 years old.
1,000 years old.
It's built. Okay. It's built in the Windsor Great Forest, the place where the kings and queens of England used to hunt. And in the centre of this forest, they'd constructed some pagan worshippers had constructed their own little temple, and a Christian missionary came across this temple, and he broke it to pieces. He pushed away that pagan site, and on that pagan site, he built this place of worship to Jesus. And he said it was as if in building it that Michael the Archangel was doing war with the powers of darkness and had overcome them in that place. So I think I owe it to 1,000 years of history to lead a church in a militant way, a church which wants to overcome the powers of darkness in that area.
Yeah.
So I tried my best just to watch the ground and see what was growing. But the very DNA of the church wouldn't allow me to do it.
Brilliant.
It wanted to advance, it wanted to move forward. So we're seeing dozens of people come into the church for the first time, dozens of people encountering Jesus, just because we've just gone with the DNA of the church.
Brilliant. Now,
It wants to grow.
a couple of things there. Hearing you speak for a couple of days and just listening to some of the things you're saying there, so I'll pick up on two things and get you to comment on them. The first is you've got a strong stewardship theme in your leadership approach. Very strong on it's not mine, it belongs to God, and my job's to help people do the best that God wants them to do. So I'd love you to make a few comments about that. The other is for those of us, and in just a moment I'm going to ask you some more specific questions about being a brand new senior minister, but
Sure.
you've obviously been able to pick up the DNA of the church. So you went in with a model,
Yes.
watch, look, listen, don't do much,
Yes.
and that's been thrown out the window, and you're running with what you've described as the DNA of the church. But you've figured that out.
Sure.
And so I'm just interested to know to what degree was it intuitive? To what degree did you ask with people? To what degree do you feel like God prompted you around that? And just so that some comments just around that stewardship approach to leadership and just figuring out this is particularly for those of us transitioning churches. I'm in that position myself.
Yes.
And how do you figure out that DNA and then have the humility to give it expression? So just make some comments about that, if you will.
The DNA was interesting. I made a habit from the start that I wanted to become part of the history of this building. So every morning at 8 o'clock, I with a giant key, open the front doors to this building, and I go and kneel at the front of this church, and I spend that time at the start of the day alone talking to Jesus. But I wanted to do it in the building. It's warmer for sure in my study. It was -4 in England when I left. But I wanted to begin to feel it and to hear God speak to me in that context. So I wanted to begin to do it in prayer. But I was also very clear that the people were frustrated. They had been waiting patiently for some time for somebody to come and bring direction and leadership to the thing. And I would not have helped that level of frustration by saying, we're just going to hold fast for another 12 months. So the very culture of the thing felt as if it was ready to burst open. It felt as if it was a ship that had been meandering on the waves for some time, but didn't quite know where it was going. And so I felt under God through prayer, listening to the frustrations of the people, and hearing something of the history of the place, that this place was ready to move. And so just the tiniest tweaks have allowed that to take place, just to give it a hint of direction, a hint of purpose. And people all over the place are rising to the challenge.
Isn't that great?
It's
but it definitely requires a degree of flexibility and a degree of courage too. I'm hearing that. So thank you for being that example for us. And just on the stewardship of people, tell us, just dig around that a little bit more for us.
I think my ethos of ministry is taken from Ephesians 4, that God gave apostles and prophets and pastors and evangelists and teachers to equip God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ can come to maturity. And I'm trying to outwork that on all sorts of levels. I'm aware of the fact that my job is to equip people for works of service. So we have, within St. Michael's, within our church plants, we have 30 different people who preach on Sundays. So we're giving people opportunity to minister. So we are equipping people and we are releasing people. But the Ephesians thing also reminded me that actually it's about multiple gifts. And I am not the full counsel of God to the church in Warfield. And I'm certainly not the full counsel of God to the church in the United Kingdom. So it's about playing my part, to recognize what my role is in that, and to staff my weaknesses. So I was very keen, very quickly, to have a staff team which wasn't like me. I needed people who could pick up the areas that I couldn't pick up. I'm very good at broad brush strokes. I know where we want to go. I know what it should look like. I'm the strategist within the organization. But the day-to-day pastoral care Well, I need people whose primary gifting is pastoral, who have an affinity to come alongside a person, sometimes for the long haul. And that wasn't me. I wasn't able to do that in that context. I have to staff my weaknesses, and I have to release people to be what they will be. So all that came from that Ephesians 4 verse. Just bringing in multiple gifts to equip God's people so that they can come to maturity.
Fantastic. Yeah. Just you, 23 years of ministry, and just recently, in 4 or 5 months, you've taken on a senior minister's role. You've uncovered a number of things that you've been using for that role to be helpful for you.
Yes.
So in very early days of transition and change,
Yes.
what have you noticed, what have you observed, and what would you be comfortable to share with us in this conversation?
Indeed. I think I've concluded that lots of people have lots of advice for that particular period. Frustration comes when we try and be something we're not. And I had to very quickly come to the conclusion that people have advised me to behave in a particular way, in a particular fashion in this place. I can't do it. I can only be who I am before God. So I went out of my way just to be me and to present me with all my weaknesses. I can't be the hyper serious Anglican at the front who looks like the old distinguished leader. I'm not wired that way. So I will stand at the front and I will have fun. And if I've learned anything in all these years of ministry, is you have to enjoy it. So Jesus told us that his burden is light. And every now and then the whole thing feels overpowering, and I have to remind myself, this is God's church. I just get the privilege of being a co-laborer. And I come back to the point of being myself. I stand in front of the people with my vulnerability, and I lead with joy. And my big leadership lessons are on the way, because I think it's impossible to be a minister without getting hurt from time to time. I think it's impossible to live at all without getting hurt from time to time. My big lessons for leadership is I will walk with my spirit sweet and my baggage laid to one side. So every now and then I have to come before God and say, God, I've picked this up. Somebody's hurt me again. I give this back to you. I will keep my spirit sweet. I will walk with a sparkle in my eyes and my spirit sweet. And I'll walk before you unburdened. And I've managed to do that. And it's been an effort from time to time. But we trap ourselves. We are unable to finish our journey sometimes if we pick up things and we hold them as baggage inside us. And it colours the way we see things. It affects our ability to minister effectively. And ultimately, it'll stop us fulfilling our destiny before God. So I keep my spirit sweet and I keep my baggage left behind. One of the phrases we use around here is be yourself, everybody else is taken. Absolutely. And it's like, how do you... It's a useful statement. Yeah, when I first started in this role, someone said to me, you have big shoes to fill. And they just sort of looked at me and nodded, and I just said straight away, I don't know where it came from, but I'm glad I did. I said, they're different shoes. Absolutely. And that's exactly the step. Yes. Any tough decisions? And how did you process them and handle them? Decisions you just know you've got to make as a leader. They're hard, they're not easy. They really just have to be made. What journey did you go through and process did you use to do that? Yeah. So I always pray about every major decision. And I've discovered in my journey that there are very few people out there who can help, but there are people out there who can help. So very quickly I'm able to pick up a phone and say, this is what I'm facing. You've probably been there before me. How did you respond to that? And there's something in that multitude of counsel which gives me wisdom. So I know that I'm 4 months into a position that I haven't held before. I came with a whole pile of skills which I'd acquired through the rest of my ministry. I knew how to lead teams. I knew how to communicate. I knew how to do a whole range of things which are necessary for this position, but none of them were this position. And so people who are just a little bit ahead of me, I'm very, very quick to say, how did you solve this? And I take a range of opinions on it. and then I go ahead and make a decision.
And then you act on the decision and own it.
Decision, absolutely.
Fantastic. So bringing this to a conclusion, one of the values that these conversations that I'd love people to get out of is a next generation. So when you've got 5, 15, 20, 25 years of ministry under your belt, there are a few things that you just want to be able to etch in stone for the next generation, or in this particular environment, post on their Facebook wall. And so if that was, just some things that you wanted to say to the next generation, what would they be?
Yeah, my big one returns to the point. I want people to get to the point where the love of God compels them, where there is no other motivation. And so I remember as a young man, my motivation for ministry was, I'll get to travel the world, I'll get to go to other countries, I'll get to stand in front of lots of people and be famous. And then having done that, and having become familiar with countless airports and countless conference centres and everything except the country, I came to the conclusion that actually that was not the motivation for ministry. And I had to keep that whole thing pure. My motivation is the love of God compels me. So if I stand in front of a crowd of people and that's my motivation, then I will communicate Jesus. If there's anything else in my spirit, I'll communicate something which is not effective and will not help these people. So I have to keep refreshing myself with, is this about the love of God? Or has something of my ego got in the way here? And that's a constant battle.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to be popular.
Sort of like you're always trimming the sails, isn't it? You're just checking that you're
Absolutely.
on track here and that you're headed in that right direction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what else?
You have to pull... I have a key person who I would refer to as my spiritual director. He was the person who supervised my PhD in child evangelism. And I've kept him on board. He lives about 100 miles away, so it's quite a trek. But I go and see him once every 10 weeks, and I sit with him, and he tells me the things that nobody else will tell me. The difficulty with being the leader is people do want to please you. So if flaws have crept into your character, you need to be able to sit down with somebody and say, hey, I'm walking through this, and he needs to be able to say, or she needs to be able to say, actually, that doesn't sound as if you're honouring Jesus in that response. So find a key person who will walk with you on that journey. Doesn't need to be another church leader. Doesn't need to be anybody's involved in church leadership at all. But it needs to be somebody who's deeply connected to Jesus and is able to speak into your life. And we are hard to speak into. People are sometimes intimidated by leadership. You need to find somebody who doesn't worship us, who is very quick to say, actually, that's nonsense.
Knows everything about you and loves you anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe just one more as we conclude.
I don't know if I've got one more. I am probably coming to the... I think the final one would be I always battle with that work-life balance thing. I think we all battle with that. And I've concluded that actually I can't quite do it in the way that people say I should do it, where you take that specific day at this specific time and that's the family day. And so I have to work seasonally. And I know that there are periods in ministry which are intense. And I know at that point my entire focus is on what I'm doing. But I have to therefore set aside a season where I connect with my family. I make sure that all that's in place. So I can't do the Sabbath thing, because one day to actually unpack everything which is flying through my head just doesn't work. So I take the day off once a week, but my wife knows on that day off it's probably 3 or 4 hours before I'm actually even listening to what she's saying to me. So lunch might be an ideal thing to do with her, but actually being able to listen to her during lunch would probably help a little. So it's seasonal. And so you build into your year those points which are going to be intense. So we're walking into that now. We're walking into a Lenten season. We're walking into Easter. These things are high profile times and great evangelistic opportunities. But when we'll come out the other side of that, and it's a little calmer. Certainly in England, we walk towards the sun. That one day in August, we walk towards the sun at that point, and that's a season for refreshing. It's a season where we can build ourselves back up a little bit more. Yeah. And then we move into September and we push towards Christmas.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. We the similarities between what you're saying and some of the conversations we're having around here. We talk about holding priorities in tension, not ordering them.
Indeed.
If I put a whole list of things, pretty much anything in below 3 just doesn't get my attention.
Right.
But I can focus on a bunch of things while I'm here, being honouring to my role as a leader of a church.
Yes.
But when I go home, I'm a father.
Right.
And I'm a husband.
Yes.
And so having those priorities set, and when I'm on holidays, I want to be on holidays.
On holidays,
playing
absolutely.
golf and doing all those things.
Absolutely.
Mark Griffiths, I want to say thank you so much for joining us, and
You're welcome.
and really appreciate you being part of these leadership conversations. Hope you enjoyed it, and it's just been great to have you part of this conversation. See you next time on Leadership Conversations.